They said he was legal. Then they said that made him dangerous. On a cold Saturday in Minneapolis, a 37-year-old man named Alex Pretty ended up dead after an encounter with immigration agents. The detail that refuses to go away is simple and explosive. He was lawfully carrying a firearm, not hiding it, not fleeing, lawful. And yet, within hours, the story flipped. The focus wasn't on the shooting itself, it was on what he carried. Here's why that matters to you. If lawful behavior can be reinterpreted after the fact as suspicious, the definition of legal becomes flexible. And when that happens, legality stops being protection and starts becoming a liability. The administration didn't hesitate. There was no visible internal doubt, no public pause. The priority was clear: defend the agents, lock the narrative, move on. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. To justify what happened, something fundamental has to be reframed. Either this was a tragedy that shouldn't have happened, or lawful carry itself becomes evidence of threat. And once that line moves, it doesn't stop moving. What happened next was framed as a routine, an incident, an unfortunate but justified use of force. But the way this was handled tells a bigger story than one shooting on one street. Because this wasn't treated like an open question. It was treated like a problem to be sealed off. Within days, the focus shifted away from the agents and onto Pretty himself. Not his actions in the moment, not whether de-escalation was possible, but the mere fact that he was armed. That detail was elevated from context to cause, and that's where the pattern starts to emerge. This wasn't a lone response. It fit into a broader posture the administration has taken when federal enforcement collides with civilian rights. When the two conflict, the system doesn't hesitate. It resolves the tension in one direction. Now watch how fast this reframing happens. A man described as a good Samaritan in early accounts is slowly repositioned as a potential threat, not because of something he did, but because of what he possessed. Here's the question that changes how you see this. If lawful carry can be treated as suspicious after a shooting, what does lawful actually protect you from? The core claim the administration is making is subtle but powerful. That the shooting wasn't about a mistake or a misjudgment, it was about risk management. And to make that claim hold, they needed to redefine what risk looks like. So officials began pointing to details that, under normal circumstances, wouldn't stand out at all. Pretty wasn't accused of firing a weapon. He wasn't accused of threatening anyone. Instead, attention zeroed in on the fact that he was carrying a gun, and more than that he had extra equipment. The implication was clear. Preparedness itself was suspicious. This is where the framing shifts. If carrying legally is normal, the shooting is hard to justify. If carrying legally is recast as inherently alarming, the justification starts to write itself. The meaning changes without the law changing. But notice what's missing from that narrative. There's no clear explanation of an imminent threat, no specific act that crossed a line in that moment. The justification relies almost entirely on what he had, not what he did. Here's why that matters. When possession replaces behavior as the trigger, the standard quietly lowers. And once that standard lowers, it doesn't just apply to one case. It becomes a template. And that's where this story stops being about one man. This is where the situation escalates, because the argument didn't stay confined to this one shooting. It started to harden into a broader rule about how civilians and federal agents interact. A senior federal prosecutor publicly put it into words. If you approach law enforcement while armed, he said, there is a high likelihood officers will be legally justified in shooting you. That's not a description of a specific threat. That's a blanket presumption. The presence of a gun alone becomes enough. Now pause on that. For years, lawful carry has been defended as compatible with public life. Grocery stores, sidewalks, traffic stops. Suddenly the rules shift when federal agents are involved. The same action that's legal everywhere else becomes lethal in their proximity. This kind of normalization is how lines move without legislation. No vote, no court ruling, just a new expectation quietly asserted. Historically, this is how emergency logic spreads. First, it's framed as common sense, then as policy, then as precedent. Here's where the story flips. The issue is no longer what happened in Minneapolis. It's what this reasoning permits going forward. Because once lethal force is presumed justified by default, restraint becomes optional. And that's when backlash begins to form. The backlash wasn't abstract. It came from groups that almost never break with this administration. Gun rights organizations that usually stay aligned suddenly drew a line. Not over politics. Over a principle they see as existential. They zeroed in on the contradiction. On one hand, officials publicly celebrate lawful carry as a constitutional right. On the other, they argue that the same lawful carry can justify killing the person exercising it. Those two positions can't coexist for long. Here's the detail that changes how you see this. The criticism wasn't aimed at the president. It was aimed downward, at prosecutors, at individual statements, at interpretations. The top stayed insulated while the logic came from the top anyway. Watch the pattern. The administration's senior figures defend the agents by implying common gun carry practices signal danger. Meanwhile, allied groups attack a single official's wording as if this were a messaging error instead of a coordinated posture. That gap matters because it shows where the real tension sits, not between the government and its critics, but inside the coalition itself. When words and actions diverge this sharply, one of them eventually wins. And in moments like this, it's rarely the rhetoric that survives. The pressure doesn't release here, it compounds. Then everything starts to pile up. First, the administration doubles down. There's no walk back, no clarification that this was an exceptional case. The defense of the agents hardens, even as questions spread. Second, silence. Key officials who helped shape the narrative don't retreat, but they also don't engage further. The message is already out there, and it's allowed to stand. Third, confusion on the ground. Lawful gun owners are left guessing what standard now applies when federal agents are nearby. This is how control is lost. Not all at once, but through overlapping signals that don't line up. One branch says carry is protected, another implies it's dangerous. A prosecutor suggests it can get you killed. No single rule is announced, but the risk becomes unmistakable. Now watch how fast this tightens. When enforcement agencies feel exposed, they don't narrow their claims, they widen them. That's how liability is avoided, by lowering expectations of restraint rather than raising standards of conduct. What happens if this continues? If every encounter is judged not by actions, but by hypothetical risk? Because once fear becomes the metric, escalation isn't the exception. It's the default. At this point, the story turns toward you, whether you're political or not. Because this isn't about ideology. It's about how rules are experienced in real life. Imagine you're doing everything by the book. You're carrying legally. You believe the law is a shield, not a trap. And then you learn that after something goes wrong, the very thing that made you compliant can be used to explain why force was justified against you. Not because you acted recklessly, but because you existed in the wrong moment with the wrong equipment. That changes behavior fast. People don't read court rulings, they read outcomes, and the outcome here is fear and hesitation. Fear of intervening, fear of helping, fear of even being present. Residents near the shooting said they felt less safe afterward, not more. That's the opposite of what enforcement is supposed to achieve. This is where trust erodes quietly, not through speeches, but through calculation. People start asking themselves whether staying out of sight is safer than doing the right thing. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because that feeling is the signal, and it leads directly to the system that produced it. What allows this to happen isn't chaos, it's structure. Federal agencies are built around one overriding incentive: protect authority first. When something threatens that authority, the response is almost automatic. Responsibility is pushed outward, risk is redefined, and narratives are adjusted to make the system appear consistent, even when it isn't. Here's the unsettling insight. Rights don't usually disappear through open confrontation. They erode through conditional logic. Lawful becomes lawful unless. Protected becomes protected until. In this case, lawful carry is respected until it conflicts with federal enforcement. When that happens, the system doesn't adapt itself. It adapts the meaning of the right. This isn't about any one administration. It's how power stabilizes itself under pressure, by creating ambiguity that always resolves in the same direction, toward the state, away from the individual. Mainstream coverage often treats these moments as political disputes, but the mechanism is quieter than that. It's about incentives, liability, and control. Once an agency learns it can justify lethal outcomes by broadening what counts as threat, that logic doesn't stay isolated. It becomes reusable. And that's why what happens next isn't random. It's already taking shape. From here, the trajectory splits and neither path is clean. One direction is containment. The administration holds its line, the controversy slowly cools, and nothing is formally changed. No new policy, no reversal. But the message lingers. Lawful carry remains legal on paper, while uncertainty does the real work. People adjust their behavior without being told to. That's the quiet outcome. The other direction is escalation. Pressure builds from inside the coalition. Gun groups push harder. Legal challenges form. Courts are forced to weigh in, not on abstract rights, but on whether possession alone can justify lethal force. That path is slower, louder, and far less predictable. Notice what's already happening. Nobody is rushing to clarify the standard. Nobody is drawing a bright line. That hesitation tells you something. The next move is being shaped behind the scenes, not in public statements. Momentum matters here. Once a new assumption takes hold, it's hard to dislodge, especially when it benefits enforcement agencies and costs politicians nothing up front. The question isn't which path is better, it's which one becomes irreversible first. And that brings us to the final layer of this story. What this ultimately exposes is a fragile illusion. The idea that rights are fixed while enforcement is flexible. In reality, it often works the other way around. Enforcement stays rigid, rights bend. The killing of Alex Pretty isn't just about one encounter or one justification. It's about how quickly a good Samaritan can be redefined when the system feels threatened. One moment, lawful carry is celebrated. The next, it's quietly treated as a liability. And that contradiction isn't an accident. It's the pressure point. Here's the reframing that matters. This wasn't a breakdown of the system. It was the system working as designed when its priorities collide. The open question now isn't whether this will happen again. It's how often and under what new assumptions. Because once legality depends on who's standing in front of you, the rules are no longer neutral. If you want to understand where this goes next and how these lines keep shifting, that's what we track here. Follow, subscribe, and stay with the analysis. This story isn't finished.